This isn't a word for the faint of heart or for those who are satisfied with their current state. No, this is a word for the ones who have been waiting, praying, and believing that God will show up and show out in their lives.
Welcome to Napoleon Hill's Daily Millionaire Mindset, where we teach you the timeless principles that turn ambition into achievement. Subscribe today and start creating the life you deserve.
I come to you today with a word of encouragement, a word of urgency, and a word of hope. A word that I believe is not just for a few of us, but for all of us. A word that speaks directly to the heart of what many of us are going through right now. That word is this: God is about to snatch you out with a sudden move. Now, I know that some of you may be hearing this and thinking to yourself, what does that even mean? What kind of move are we talking about? It's a move that is not expected, a move that comes without warning. And yet it is a move that will change everything. It is a divine intervention, a supernatural shift that comes when we least expect it, but when we most need it. Let me remind you of something. In life, we often find ourselves caught in situations that seem impossible. We face challenges that feel insurmountable. We are burdened by the weight of our circumstances. And sometimes we even feel like we're sinking, like there's no way out. But beloved, I am here to tell you that God is not bound by our limitations. He is not restricted by the confines of time, space, or our own understanding. God can and will step in and make a move that will change your situation in the blink of an eye. If you've been standing in faith, if you've been holding on to His promises, then hear me now. God is about to snatch you out with a sudden move. It's coming, and it's coming soon. Now let's take a step back for a moment and look at what this sudden move from God really means. To be snatched out is not just a small change. It's not just a little adjustment in your life. No, beloved, it's a complete transformation. It's a sudden and dramatic shift that pulls you from one place and puts you in another. It's the moment when God steps into your life and interrupts the enemy's plan, turns your situation upside down, and establishes His will in a way that no one can deny. Do you remember the story of the children of Israel? For years they were enslaved in Egypt, oppressed, broken, and scattered. They cried out to God for deliverance, and for a long time it seemed as though nothing was happening. They were stuck. But in a moment, in a sudden move, God raised up Moses, and the course of history changed forever. One night they were still in bondage, and the next morning they were walking free. The Red Sea parted, Pharaoh's army was drowned, and the people of Israel were snatched out of Egypt with a move that no one saw coming. Now, I know some of you are thinking, that's a nice story, but that happened thousands of years ago. What about me? What about my situation? Can God really do something like that for me? Beloved, let me assure you that the same God who parted the Red Sea, the same God who delivered His people from oppression, is still the same God today. He is not changed. His power has not diminished. And if He can do it for them, He can do it for you. There's a powerful verse in the Bible that says, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Exodus 14:14. In the story of the Red Sea, the Israelites didn't have to do anything but trust God and be still. They didn't have to figure it out on their own, and they didn't have to force the waters to part. God did the work for them. All they had to do was believe. And so I say to you today, believe that God is working on your behalf. Even when you don't see it, believe that He is moving behind the scenes, orchestrating things in your favor. Believe that the sudden move is coming. And when it does, it will blow your mind. I understand that for some of you, this word may feel like a distant hope. Maybe you've been praying for years, and it feels like your prayers have hit the ceiling. Maybe you've been trusting, but the weight of your circumstances is starting to feel too heavy. I want to encourage you today not to lose heart. I want to remind you that God's timing is perfect. His ways are higher than our ways, and His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Even when it seems like nothing is happening, trust that God is still at work. His sudden move may be closer than you think. Think about Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, thrown into prison for something he didn't do, and forgotten by those he helped. He must have felt abandoned. He must have felt like his dreams were nothing more than a distant memory. But then, in a moment, a sudden move. Joseph went from being a prisoner to being the second in command over all of Egypt. His dream was fulfilled, and God used his circumstances to position him for something greater than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't a gradual process, it was sudden. It was a move that turned his whole life around in an instant. There are some of you right now who are in a similar position. You may not understand why you're where you are, and you may not understand why things have been so difficult. But I want to remind you that God has a purpose for you. He hasn't forgotten you. He hasn't abandoned you, and he is about to snatch you out of your current situation with a move that will leave everyone in awe. But here's the key. You have to be ready when God makes his sudden move. You don't want to be caught off guard. You don't want to miss the moment. That's why it's so important that you stay in a posture of faith, in a posture of expectation. You don't know when the moment will come, but you can be sure that it will come. When it does, you need to be ready to step into your new season. How do you prepare for this sudden move? First, you have to remain faithful. Don't let your circumstances determine your faith. Keep trusting, keep praying, and keep believing. Second, you have to stay obedient. Don't get tired of doing good. Don't get discouraged when things don't go your way. God sees you, and he rewards those who remain faithful. And finally, you have to be patient. The sudden move will come at the right time, God's time. Don't rush it. Don't try to force it. Just trust that God is working everything out for your good. Now, I know that some of you may still be wondering, what if God doesn't come through for me? What if the sudden move never happens? Beloved, I want you to know that God's timing is perfect. His moves are never late, and they're never early. They are always on time. And sometimes the greatest move of all is not a change in our circumstances, but a change in our hearts. God's greatest work is not always in the external, but in the internal. He may be preparing you, strengthening you, and building your character for what's to come. Trust that even when you don't see the sudden move happening on the outside, God is still working on the inside. As I close today, I want to leave you with this thought. God is about to snatch you out with a sudden move. It might be a breakthrough in your finances, a restoration in your relationships, a healing in your body, or a new opportunity that you never saw coming. Whatever it is, it's coming. And when it does, it will be a testimony to the greatness and faithfulness of our God. God's intervention in our lives can sometimes feel like a distant or abstract concept, especially when we're in the midst of hardship or waiting for a breakthrough. But one thing we must remember is that sudden moves are not accidents in God's plan. While we may not always see it or understand it, divine intervention is woven into the fabric of God's greater design for our lives. There are moments when God decides to step in and move in ways that are so sudden, so powerful, that they change the course of our entire journey. These are moments when we can only stand in awe and realize that his hand was at work all along. Consider the story of the Israelites as they were enslaved in Egypt. For centuries they suffered under oppression and cried out to God for deliverance. They were stuck, bound by chains that seemed impossible to break. The weight of their oppression felt unbearable. They had likely lost hope that their cries would ever be answered. But in that very moment of despair, when they were at the end of their strength, God's sudden move came. He sent Moses, and through a series of miraculous events, the entire nation was freed in a moment of divine intervention. They were snatched from the grip of Pharaoh's rule, and the Red Sea parted in front of them, allowing them to escape to freedom. This wasn't a gradual transition, it was a sudden shift. One moment, they were slaves, and the next, they were free. This wasn't just a change of circumstances, it was a divine act, a move of God that demonstrated his sovereignty and his love for his people. The suddenness of God's move is often what shakes us to the core. We get so caught up in the ordinary and the day-to-day struggle that we forget that God works in ways beyond our comprehension. His moves don't always come on our timeline or according to our expectations, but they come exactly when we need them the most. There are times in life when we are pushed to the edge of our capacity, when we feel like we're about to break, and that's often when God's intervention arrives. When we can no longer rely on our strength, when we have no more solutions, when we've exhausted every option, that's when God steps in and makes a move that is undeniably divine. In those moments, it is important to remember that God's timing is perfect. We may not always understand why things happen when they do, or why certain events unfold in such an unexpected manner, but we can rest assured that God's plan for us is not dictated by chance or luck. He has a purpose for everything, and his interventions are always intentional. His ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. It's in the suddenness of his movements that we are reminded of his transcendence. We see clearly that there are forces at work far beyond what we can control or comprehend. In the same way that he delivered the Israelites with a mighty hand, he is still capable of intervening in our lives today in miraculous, transformative ways. Take a moment to reflect on your own life. Think about the times when God showed up in unexpected ways. Maybe it was a financial breakthrough you didn't anticipate, an opportunity that came out of nowhere, or healing when the doctors had no more answers. These moments are not mere coincidences. They are divine interventions, sudden moves that only God could have orchestrated. It's not that we were deserving or that we had earned it, but because of God's love and grace, he reached into our circumstances and turned things around in a way that left us speechless. Sometimes we may even feel like we're in a holding pattern. We are praying, waiting, and hoping for God to move, but nothing seems to change. But in reality, even in those seasons of silence, God is still working behind the scenes. Sometimes God's sudden moves are preceded by seasons of preparation. Just as a seed needs time to grow underground before it breaks through the surface, so too does God sometimes allow us to go through seasons of preparation. He's shaping us, strengthening us, refining our character, and positioning us for the breakthroughs ahead. When the moment arrives, it will feel sudden, but it will have been years or even a lifetime in the making. It's in these moments that we realize God's hand has been on us all along, even in the waiting. Think of the life of Joseph. He was sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused and imprisoned for years. His circumstances seemed to be a series of setbacks, but God was setting him up for something greater. When the time was right, when everything was aligned, God orchestrated a sudden move. In one day, Joseph went from being a prisoner to being second in command of all of Egypt. His sudden rise wasn't by chance. It was a move orchestrated by God to fulfill a greater purpose. Joseph's life is a testimony to the fact that divine intervention doesn't always come when we expect it, but it will always come at the right time in the right moment. For some of us, the waiting may feel long, and the frustration may feel unbearable. But let me remind you that God's silence is not his absence. Even when we don't see him working, he is always moving behind the scenes, preparing us, positioning us, and preparing the way for his sudden move in our lives. Trust in the process, because there is a divine intervention waiting for you at just the right time. And when it comes, it will change everything. The suddenness of God's move often leaves us awestruck. We can look back and see how perfectly everything came together, even though in the moment we couldn't understand it. The sudden move will often catch us off guard, but it will be exactly what we need. It's not always easy to trust God's timing, especially when we are in the middle of difficult circumstances. But we can find comfort in knowing that God is always working in ways that we can't see. His sudden moves are part of his plan for our lives, and they come at the perfect moment. So when you feel like you're at the end of your rope, when it feels like nothing is changing, hold on to this truth. God is about to make a sudden move in your life. And when he does, it will be a move that only he could orchestrate, one that will take you from where you are to where he's calling you to be. God's power to transform our circumstances is a central theme throughout the Bible and is a truth that resonates deeply with each of us in our everyday lives. So often we find ourselves trapped in situations that seem hopeless. We face obstacles that seem too large to overcome, and we feel stuck in patterns of life that appear unchangeable. But the good news is that God's power to transform our circumstances is not limited by the size of our problems. In fact, it's precisely when we are in the most difficult, the most desperate of situations that God's transforming power is at its most evident. There are countless stories throughout Scripture where God transformed the lives of his people in ways that defied human logic or expectation. One of the most striking examples is the story of the Israelites in Egypt. They were oppressed and enslaved for hundreds of years. Their cries of despair rose to heaven, but their situation remained the same. They were stuck in a cycle of slavery, seemingly without a way out. But in that moment of helplessness, God intervened in a dramatic way, parting the Red Sea and allowing his people to escape the very bondage that had once seemed insurmountable. This wasn't just a small change, it was a total transformation of their circumstances. In an instant, the Israelites went from being slaves to being free, from wandering aimlessly in a desert to heading toward a promised land of abundance. God's power took them from oppression to freedom, from fear to hope, from defeat to victory. This same transformative power is available to us today. We often forget that the God who parted the Red Sea, the God who brought down the walls of Jericho, is still at work in our lives. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. No matter how difficult our circumstances are, we are never beyond the reach of God's power to bring change. Whether it's a financial struggle, a broken relationship, a health crisis, or even a season of depression, God can step into our lives and transform our situation in ways that we can't even imagine. There are moments in life when we feel completely helpless. We look at our circumstances and see no way out. The future seems uncertain, and the present feels overwhelming. It's easy in those moments to feel like we're fighting a losing battle. But God has a way of turning what seems impossible into a testimony of his greatness. When we surrender our circumstances to God, when we trust in his timing and his methods, he can bring about a transformation that we never thought possible. It's not always an immediate or easy process, but when God begins to move, the change can be profound. Take the example of Joseph. Joseph's life seemed to be a never-ending string of disappointments and setbacks. His brothers sold him into slavery, and he was wrongfully imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. For years, it seemed like everything was working against him. Yet through it all, God was shaping his character, building his faith, and preparing him for something greater. Joseph's circumstances seemed impossible to overcome. But at just the right time, God's transforming power turned Joseph's life around completely. One day he was a prisoner, and the next he was second in command of all of Egypt. God transformed Joseph's dire situation into a position of power and influence, a transformation so radical that only God could have orchestrated it. What looked like a series of unfortunate events turned out to be the very steps God used to prepare Joseph for his ultimate purpose. Another powerful example of God's transformative power is seen in the story of Saul of Tarsus. Saul was a ruthless persecutor of Christians, a man who was actively trying to destroy the early church. He was filled with hatred and self-righteousness, believing that he was doing God's will by imprisoning and killing Christians. But God, in his infinite grace and power, met Saul on the road to Damascus in a moment of dramatic transformation. Saul was struck blind, and in that moment his entire perspective on life was flipped upside down. God healed him, and Saul, now known as Paul, went on to become one of the greatest apostles in the history of the church. God took a man who was the enemy of Christ and transformed him into one of his most ardent advocates. The same power that changed Saul's heart and life is available to each of us. When we face difficult situations, it's easy to feel like we are at the mercy of our circumstances. We think that change is impossible, that things will never improve, and that the future looks bleak. But God's power is not limited by the walls we build around ourselves. God is a God of breakthrough, a God of transformation. He specializes in changing the narrative of our lives. No matter what you are facing, no matter how hopeless your situation feels, God has the power to intervene. He doesn't just change the external circumstances, he can change us on the inside as well, shifting our hearts, our perspectives, and our attitudes to align with his will. Transformation often begins in our hearts. We may not see immediate changes in our external circumstances, but when God begins to work within us, we begin to see the world through a different lens. We begin to trust more deeply, to have hope even in the midst of trials, and to believe that God is working all things for our good. God's power to transform us is not just about changing our circumstances, it's about changing us. It's about renewing our minds, giving us peace in the storm, and filling us with joy that transcends our trials. When we allow God to work within us, He prepares us for the outward transformation that will come. The power of God to transform our circumstances isn't just for the big moments or dramatic interventions. It's also for the everyday struggles. Whether it's a battle with anxiety, a difficult relationship, or financial hardship, God's power is always available to bring about change. Sometimes the transformation is gradual, but make no mistake, God is always at work and He is always moving to bring about your ultimate good. Even when it seems like nothing is happening, He is working behind the scenes, setting things in motion, and aligning the pieces for your breakthrough. So if you are facing a difficult situation today, I encourage you to trust in the power of God to transform your circumstances. Know that your current situation does not define your future. God is able to take what seems impossible and turn it into a testimony of His greatness. Keep your faith in Him, keep your eyes on Him, and wait for the moment when His transforming power breaks through into your life in ways you could never have imagined. Faith and expectation are foundational to our walk with God. These two principles are the very heartbeat of the Christian life, for they are the lenses through which we see and experience God's promises and His interventions in our lives. Faith is the belief that God is who He says He is, and that He will do what He says He will do. Expectation, on the other hand, is the anticipation of that faith being realized. It's living with a sense of hope and belief that God is going to move in our lives, even when we don't know how or when. Together, faith and expectation create an atmosphere for God to work and open the door for us to receive the blessings He has for us. At the core of faith is trust. Trust that God is faithful, that He is good, and that He always keeps His promises. But faith isn't just a passive belief, it's active. It's stepping out even when the road is unclear, knowing that God will guide you along the way. The Bible tells us that faith without works is dead. James 2:26, meaning that if we truly believe in God, our actions will reflect that belief. Faith prompts us to move forward even when we can't see the full picture, trusting that God's plan is greater than our understanding. Expectation, on the other hand, is the anticipation that our faith will lead to something tangible. It's not just waiting passively for God to show up, but actively believing that He will do something. When we are in expectation, we live with an eager sense of anticipation, knowing that God is working behind the scenes, even when we don't see immediate results. Expectation doesn't mean that we demand a particular outcome, but rather that we believe God is going to show up in a way that's best for us. Expectation aligns our hearts with God's timing and His will. It's a belief that God's promises will not return void and that He is faithful to bring about what He has promised. One powerful example of the importance of faith and expectation in the Bible is the story of the woman with the issue of blood. She had suffered for 12 years with a medical condition that no doctor could heal, and she was considered an outcast because of her condition. But when she heard about Jesus and His power to heal, something shifted in her heart. She had faith that Jesus could heal her, but she also had expectation. She believed that if she could just touch the hem of His garment, she would be healed. In Mark 5:28, it says, "If I touch even His garments, I will be made well." Her faith was combined with expectation. She didn't just hope for healing, she actively believed that it would happen. And when she reached out and touched Jesus, her healing was instantaneous. This story teaches us an important lesson. Faith and expectation go hand in hand. Without faith, we cannot expect God to move. Without expectation, our faith can become passive and stagnant. It's the combination of the two that brings transformation and breakthrough. The woman's healing was not just a result of her belief in Jesus' ability to heal, but also her belief that something would happen if she acted on her faith. Faith and expectation are also evident in the story of Abraham. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, yet his wife Sarah was barren and they were both old. In Romans 4:18-21, it says that Abraham, without weakening in his faith, believed that God could fulfill His promise despite the impossibility of the situation. Abraham's faith was strong, but his expectation was just as powerful. He believed that God was able to do what He had promised, even though it seemed beyond reason. And as a result, Abraham became the father of Isaac, and from him came the nation of Israel. Faith and expectation are essential in receiving God's promises. Without expectation, we may find ourselves passively waiting for God to act without actively looking for the ways in which he is working. When we expect God to move, we become more attuned to his voice, more sensitive to his leading, and more aware of the doors he is opening. Expectation shifts our focus from our circumstances to the faithfulness of God. It's the difference between waiting for something to happen and actively believing that something will happen even when the situation seems impossible. Sometimes we may feel that our faith is insufficient or that our expectation is too high. We might feel like God isn't listening or that he's taking too long to answer our prayers. But in those moments, we are called to remember that God's timing is perfect and he will come through in his time. Even when we cannot see the results right away, faith and expectation allow us to trust that God is still at work. They create in us a posture of trust and hope, no matter the delay. Consider the example of the Israelites waiting for deliverance from Egypt. For hundreds of years, they cried out to God for help, but their situation did not change immediately. Yet they held on to the hope that God would intervene. Their faith in God's promises and their expectation of his deliverance carried them through long years of oppression. And when God finally did move, it was with great power, parting the Red Sea and leading them to freedom. Our expectation is not in vain. God honors our faith and meets us in the place of our expectation. Sometimes God's answers are delayed not because he is unwilling, but because he is preparing us for something greater. When we wait in faith and expectation, we are positioning ourselves to receive what God has for us, even if it looks different than what we had initially imagined. Expectation also fuels our perseverance. When we believe that God will move, it gives us the strength to keep pressing forward even when obstacles seem insurmountable. It helps us to endure seasons of waiting, knowing that God is faithful and will fulfill his promises. Expectation enables us to walk by faith, not by sight, and to believe that God is working even when we cannot see the results yet. As we walk through life, we must remember the words of Hebrews 11:6, which tells us, "And without faith it is impossible to please God, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him." Faith and expectation are the keys to unlocking God's blessings and experiencing his power. When we have faith that God will move, and when we expect that he will fulfill his promises, we open the door for God to work in ways that we could never have anticipated. It's in that space of belief and anticipation that God is able to do the impossible. Patience in God's timing is one of the most challenging aspects of our spiritual journey. We live in a world that thrives on immediacy, instant results, quick fixes, and immediate gratification. Our culture values speed and efficiency, and often we expect the same from God. Yet one of the most important lessons we must learn as followers of Christ is that God's timing is not our own. God is not in a rush, and his plans for us unfold in his perfect time, not according to our schedule or our desires. This can be difficult to accept, especially when we feel the weight of waiting, when we are desperate for answers, or when we face trials that seem to stretch on indefinitely. But learning to trust in God's timing can transform our entire perspective on life and our relationship with him. Patience in God's timing requires us to surrender our own timeline to God's greater plan. It's about acknowledging that God knows what is best for us, even when we don't understand the delays or the silence. When we are waiting for something, whether it's a breakthrough, a change in circumstances, or a specific prayer to be answered, it's easy to become frustrated, discouraged, or even angry. We wonder why things aren't happening according to our expectations, and sometimes we question whether God hears our prayers. But the truth is that God is always at work, even when we can't see it. His delays are not denials, and his silence does not mean he is absent. God's timing is perfect, and it's in the waiting that we often grow the most. One of the most profound examples of patience in God's timing is found in the story of Abraham. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, but Abraham's wife, Sarah, was barren, and they were both well beyond the age of childbearing. God's promise seemed impossible, yet Abraham believed. However, the wait for the fulfillment of God's promise was long. Abraham had to wait 25 years for the birth of his son Isaac. During those years, Abraham faced many trials, and at times he struggled with doubt and impatience. He even took matters into his own hands by having a child with Sarah's servant, Hagar. But that wasn't God's plan. It was only when Abraham trusted God's timing and fully surrendered to his will that Isaac was born. Abraham's story reminds us that patience is not about doing nothing in the waiting, but about trusting God's process even when the outcome doesn't come as quickly or in the way we expect. Another powerful example of patience in God's timing can be seen in the life of Joseph. Joseph's story, as told in the book of Genesis, is one of great triumph, but also of prolonged suffering and waiting. Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and wrongfully imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. Yet through all his trials, Joseph remained patient and faithful, trusting that God had a purpose in his suffering. It took years for God's promise to come to fruition. But in the end, Joseph was elevated to a position of great authority in Egypt, and his ability to interpret Pharaoh's dreams saved many people, including his own family. What seemed like a series of setbacks and delays were actually part of God's perfect plan to prepare Joseph for the position he would eventually hold. Joseph's patience in God's timing allowed him to see God's hand at work, even in the darkest of circumstances. Patience in God's timing isn't just about waiting passively, it's about active trust. While we wait, we are called to continue trusting in God's goodness, his faithfulness, and his sovereignty. Patience is a reflection of our faith in God's character and his perfect will. We trust that he knows what's best for us even when we can't see the full picture. It's like waiting for a meal to be prepared by a chef who knows exactly how to make it perfect. We might not understand all the steps or why certain ingredients are needed, but we trust that the final result will be worth the wait. Similarly, when we trust God's timing, we are acknowledging that he is orchestrating our lives in a way that we can't fully understand now, but will eventually appreciate when the plan is revealed. Moreover, patience allows God to work on us while we wait. Waiting is not wasted time. It is a time of preparation, refinement, and growth. Often we grow spiritually in the waiting process. It's in the waiting that our character is shaped, our faith is strengthened, and our dependence on God is deepened. God is not just concerned with the outcome, but with the process that leads us to it. He wants to build in us a patience that reflects his own perfect timing. As we wait on God, we learn to rely more fully on him, surrendering our desire for control and learning to trust that his plans are always for our good. The Apostle Paul also writes extensively about the importance of patience in God's timing. In Romans 8:25, Paul says, "But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience." Patience in God's timing requires hope, the hope that what we are waiting for will come to pass. It's the hope that God's promises are true and that he is faithful to fulfill them, even when the wait seems long. Paul also encourages us to count it all joy when we face trials, because suffering produces perseverance, character, and hope. The waiting period, as painful or frustrating as it may be, is not wasted. It is working in us to produce something far greater than we can imagine. Waiting on God doesn't mean we are idle. It means we continue to seek him, continue to obey him, and continue to trust him even when we don't have all the answers. Patience is an active posture of faith, a choice to continue trusting, worshiping, and serving even when the breakthrough hasn't come yet. It's in the waiting that we are shaped, refined, and made more like Christ. God's timing is never late, but it is often slower than we expect. We must learn to trust that he sees the bigger picture and that his timing is always aligned with what is best for us, even when we don't understand the delay. In conclusion, patience in God's timing is not about passive waiting, but about trusting God in the process. It is about surrendering our desire for control and allowing God to work in us and through us, even when the answers seem delayed or the waiting feels long. When we learn to trust God's timing, we align ourselves with his perfect plan and allow him to transform us in the waiting period. So let us be patient, trusting that in due time, God will fulfill his promises in our lives, exactly when and how he knows is best. Obedience and preparedness are two essential components for experiencing and thriving in a shift, whether it's a change in seasons, a breakthrough, or a divine intervention in our lives. These two qualities are often the bridge between where we are and where God wants to take us. When God is preparing us for something greater, obedience and preparedness are key to navigating the shift successfully. Obedience aligns our hearts with God's will, while preparedness positions us to receive and manage the new thing He is bringing into our lives. Together, these qualities enable us to move confidently into the new season, trusting that God has equipped us for what lies ahead. Obedience is often a challenge because it requires us to submit our will to God's plan. Our natural inclination is to make decisions based on our own understanding and desires, but obedience to God often calls us to surrender our control and trust His timing and direction. In the Bible, we see countless examples of people who had to choose obedience, sometimes at great personal cost, in order to step into a new season or receive a blessing. One of the most prominent stories is that of Abraham. God asked Abraham to leave everything he knew, his family, his homeland, and go to a place God would show him. Abraham obeyed without knowing the full details of the plan, and as a result, he became the father of many nations. His obedience to God's call was the catalyst for a monumental shift in his life and the lives of countless generations. But obedience doesn't always feel easy or comfortable. Sometimes God calls us to obey when it doesn't make sense or when the outcome isn't immediately clear. This requires deep faith and trust in God's goodness and sovereignty. We see this in the story of the Israelites. When God delivered them from Egypt, they had to follow His leading through the wilderness, even when it seemed like they were walking into the unknown. At times, the journey was difficult, and the people grew impatient and frustrated. Yet their obedience to God's commands in the wilderness was a crucial part of their preparation for the promised land. Obedience is the key that unlocks the doors to our destiny, and it's often the first step toward the shift that God is orchestrating in our lives. Preparedness, on the other hand, is about more than just being ready. It's about positioning ourselves spiritually, mentally, and emotionally for what God is about to do. God's shifts often come with new responsibilities, new opportunities, and new challenges. If we aren't prepared, we may not be able to fully embrace the new season or handle the challenges that come with it. Being prepared doesn't mean having everything figured out. It means being open and available for God's direction and equipping ourselves for the changes ahead. Jesus told a parable in Matthew 25 about 10 virgins waiting for the bridegroom to arrive. 5 were wise and took oil with them, while the other 5 were foolish and ran out oil. When the bridegroom came, the wise virgins were ready and the foolish ones were left behind. This parable emphasizes the importance of preparedness. When God is shifting us into a new season, we must be spiritually prepared to step into the opportunities He has for us. This may mean strengthening our relationship with God through prayer, reading His Word, and allowing the Holy Spirit to work in our hearts to refine our character and motives. Being prepared also involves a readiness to grow and learn. When God shifts us into a new season, it often requires us to grow in ways we may not have anticipated. The Israelites had to learn how to trust God for daily provision in the wilderness. Their old way of thinking had to be replaced by a mindset that was fully reliant on God. Similarly, when God brings a shift in our lives, it's often a time for us to stretch, to learn new skills, or to adapt to new environments. Preparedness means developing the capacity to handle the weight of what God is entrusting to us. Another aspect of preparedness is emotional readiness. Shifts can bring both excitement and fear. It's easy to become overwhelmed by the unknown or to resist change, especially when it challenges our comfort zones. Emotional preparedness involves managing our anxieties and trusting God in the midst of change. The Apostle Paul speaks of this emotional readiness in Philippians 4:6-7, urging believers not to be anxious, but to present their requests to God with thanksgiving, so that His peace will guard their hearts and minds. Emotional preparedness helps us remain stable and focused, even in the midst of a season of change. God often prepares us for a shift by allowing us to go through seasons of testing and refinement. In these seasons, our obedience is tested. Are we willing to follow God's lead even when the path is unclear? Are we ready to let go of old mindsets, habits, or comforts that may hold us back from the next phase. Preparation is often a process of internal transformation, where God works in our hearts to remove distractions, refine our character, and help us embrace the new thing He wants to do in our lives. Just like a gardener prunes a tree to make it more fruitful, God often prunes us during seasons of preparation, ensuring that we are ready to bear fruit in the new season. The key to navigating a shift is not just knowing that God is moving, but being ready to move with Him. When we are obedient and prepared, we position ourselves to step into the new season without hesitation or fear. Consider the story of Joshua and the Israelites as they prepared to enter the Promised Land. After Moses' death, God instructed Joshua to lead the people into the land He had promised them. But before they could move forward, God told them to consecrate themselves, to prepare their hearts for what was about to come. Joshua 3:5. This was a time of sanctification and dedication to God's purposes, a time of aligning their hearts with His will. As we face shifts in our own lives, whether they are career changes, relocations, personal breakthroughs, or spiritual growth, we must ask ourselves if we are obedient to God's leading and prepared for what He is about to do. Obedience means saying yes to God, even when we don't fully understand the plan. Preparedness means aligning ourselves with God's will, preparing our hearts, minds, and lives for the change that is coming. Sometimes we may resist the shift because it feels uncomfortable or unfamiliar, but we must trust that God's plans are always for our good. He knows the end from the beginning, and His timing is perfect. When we are obedient and prepared, we can step confidently into the future, knowing that God has gone before us and is with us every step of the way. In conclusion, obedience and preparedness are crucial as we approach a shift in our lives. Obedience to God's leading allows us to move in step with His will, while preparedness ensures that we are ready to handle the new responsibilities, opportunities, and challenges that the shift will bring. As we cultivate both, we can trust that God will guide us through every transition and into the fullness of His plans for our lives. Trusting in God's plan, especially when we cannot see the path ahead, is one of the most profound and challenging aspects of our faith journey. As human beings, we naturally desire clarity and certainty, especially when it comes to the future. We want to know where we're going, how we'll get there, and what lies ahead. But God's ways are often different from our own, and trusting in His plan requires surrendering our desire for control and embracing the unknown with faith. Trusting in God's plan, even when we can't see it, is an act of profound belief that He knows what's best for us, even when the road ahead is unclear. From the very beginning, the Bible speaks to this trust. In Proverbs 3:5-6, we are reminded to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight. This passage encourages us to release our need to understand everything, especially when the future seems uncertain. Trusting God means that we acknowledge that His wisdom and understanding far surpass ours, and even when we can't see the way forward, we choose to believe that He is leading us with purpose. One of the most striking examples of trusting God's plan despite uncertainty is the life of Abraham. God promised Abraham that he would become the father of many nations, but there was a significant delay between the promise and its fulfillment. Abraham was advanced in age, and his wife Sarah was barren. On the surface, this promise seemed impossible, and yet Abraham chose to trust in God's plan, even when it didn't make sense. He left everything he knew and ventured into an unknown land at God's command. There were moments of doubt and impatience along the way, but God's faithfulness was evident. When Abraham was 100 years old, God fulfilled His promise and gave him a son, Isaac. Abraham's journey is a powerful testament to the fact that God's plan is often different from our own, but His timing is always perfect. Abraham couldn't see the future, but he trusted God with the details of his life, and as a result, he became the father of nations. The story of Joseph also illustrates how trust in God's plan can carry us through dark, confusing seasons. Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery, falsely accused of a crime, and imprisoned. It seemed that every turn in his life brought only more betrayal and hardship. And yet Joseph never wavered in his trust that God had a purpose for his life. In Genesis 50:20, after being reunited with his brothers, Joseph declared, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." Joseph could not see how God was working in the midst of his suffering, but he trusted that God's plan was unfolding even when the situation seemed bleak. What Joseph demonstrates is that trusting in God's plan does not mean understanding every detail. There are moments when the pieces of our lives seem scattered, disconnected, and uncertain. But God sees the big picture, and He is working all things together for our good, even when we can't see how. This can be one of the hardest things to accept in our journey of faith. We want answers. We want to know why things happen the way they do, and we want control over our circumstances. But true trust is allowing God to have control, even when we don't have the answers. It's having faith that His plan is good, even when it doesn't look like it in the moment. In the New Testament, we see the ultimate example of trusting in God's plan through the life of Jesus. Jesus, in His humanity, knew the suffering He was about to endure. He prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, asking God if there was any other way for the plan of salvation to unfold. He pleaded with God to remove the cup of suffering, yet He ultimately surrendered to God's will, saying, "Not my will, but yours be done." Jesus, in His obedience, chose to trust in God's plan of redemption, even though He couldn't see the full scope of what was about to unfold. His trust in God's plan led to the salvation of the world. Sometimes we too are called to surrender to God's will, trusting that His plan, even in its mystery, is far greater than we can comprehend. Trusting in God's plan is not always easy, especially when life feels uncertain or we face setbacks. It's natural to feel discouraged when things don't go according to our expectations. We may ask, "Why is this happening?" or "Where is God in this?" But the reality is that God is always present, even when we cannot see Him. Trusting in God's plan is ultimately about choosing to believe in His faithfulness. When we look back on the stories of Scripture and the testimonies of those around us, we see that God's faithfulness is consistent. He has always been with His people, guiding them, sustaining them, and bringing them to their promised destination, even when the journey was long and difficult. Moreover, trust in God's plan teaches us to live with hope, not in our circumstances, but in the promise that God is working all things together for good. In Romans 8:28, the Apostle Paul reminds us, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." Trusting in God's plan is not about denying the challenges or struggles we face, but about believing that even in those struggles, God is at work for our benefit. We may not understand the trials we go through, but we trust that God will use them for His glory and our ultimate good. We may not always understand the process or the reasons behind certain events, but trust in God's plan is about knowing that He is faithful. It's about believing that He sees the bigger picture and that His plan for our lives is good, even when we can't see how it all fits together. In the midst of uncertainty, we can hold fast to the truth that God is always at work. His plan is perfect, and in the end, we will see that everything was woven together with a purpose we could not have imagined. In conclusion, trusting in God's plan, even when we can't see it, is a central aspect of our faith. It calls us to surrender our need for control and to lean on God's wisdom and faithfulness. Like Abraham, Joseph, and Jesus, we are called to walk by faith, not by sight, trusting that God is working in and through our lives in ways that we may not understand. As we trust in Him, we can be confident that He will fulfill His promises, even when the path ahead is unclear. Our trust in God's plan, in the end, will lead us to a place of peace, purpose, and divine fulfillment.
If this inspired you, subscribe and follow for more, and don't miss the other videos we've lined up for you. Keep learning, keep growing. Your next breakthrough could be one click away.